Hello Raptors fans! Today we're going to be taking a look at the NBA draft. And although the Toronto Raptors have been doing their best to take themselves out of the top 10, I still think that it's as good a time as any to talk about the prospects that will hear their names called in July. On the program today, I have an up-and-coming pro scout who has been an active blogger for his site, The Kick Ahead, as well as a contributor and scout for Pro Insight, a Portland-based scouting company. His name is Henry Ward, and it's a pleasure to have him on Raptors Report. Welcome, Henry.
Well, thanks for having me on. Thanks for also giving a shout out to The Kick Ahead, which has not been too active as of late since I've done work for Pro Insight. But it's kind of how I got my start on Twitter, just sort of writing prospect reports and then sort of expanding into some more in-depth sort of basketball, team building theory, and coaching theory. But before that, I played a little bit, played a year in college, then post-retirement, I guess you could say, I started working in player development for Noah LaRoche, an NBA trainer for 4 years. That's how I kind of got my start in basketball. Have been kind of doing odd jobs all over the basketball world in terms of, internships and just picking up whatever I can from people like, the NBA, USA Basketball. And it's landing me here with Pro Insight, where I do general scouting for our clients in our backend database, and also do writing for our front end site, our media side. Pro Insight's been sort of my first scouting job, so it's been amazing.
That's fantastic. So let's kind of dive in. It's been an interesting season for the Toronto Raptors, which is kind of where my focus is. And one of the reasons that I decided to do a draft-centric podcast is because, how they've been performing, which is not very well. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the Toronto Raptors have started to win some games. They've actually won 3 in a row, which if you are cheering for the tank, if you're cheering for a high lottery pick, is probably not a good thing. So I have no idea what direction the team's going in. Who knows what the future holds, but I think that we're going to talk about the lottery end of the draft anyway. First of all, it's more exciting. I mean, the top of the draft is always very fun, seeing these sort of guys, especially this draft. It seems like there's some players that have, that generational type talent, or at least that's the billing anyway. I think that you might be able to fill us in on kind of who the guys are, what can be expected from them, like what their ceilings are like. So let's just, start off with the top 5.
Sure. So might as well start at the top. I think that Cade is without question the number 1 overall pick. I think that it's a very interesting draft. From my perspective, I think that in my opinion, I should say, I think that Cade is a clear number 1, Mobley is a clear number 2, and Suggs is a clear number 3, which is interesting because, in my view, there's not a lot of room for that opinion to be changed based on what I've seen and kind of my ideas of those players and what I value. Whereas, like last year's draft, I think we all had a pretty clear consensus, number 1 in LaMelo. But from beyond that, you could have made an argument for 100 different orders of players from 2 to 10.
Right. Because I think that a lot of the, sorry to cut you off.
No worries.
A lot of the draft picks in that draft, especially, were kind of underscouted. Like James Wiseman, he didn't get a full season of evaluation. LaMelo Ball was playing overseas in Australia, kind of difficult to gauge. But in this draft, I mean, the top 5, these are all 5 really well scouted guys, right?
Yeah, and I think, yes, that's definitely part of it. I think part of it too is just it is kind of inherent to me in their value propositions and the skills they already have. What I mean by that is I do think that not picking Cade, who is a 6'8" initiator with very few holes, hyper processing, quickly improving, NBA ready body, NBA ready thinker. I think passing on that is a huge mistake. And in a very close second, you have Evan Mobley, who's a 7-foot unicorn of sorts and generational rim protector, moves like a guard, has ball handling skills that are really outside of what expectation would be for a 7-footer, very smart passer, will be a budding shooter. And so I think that he, in a lot of drafts is number 1 overall, but he just happens to be in a draft with Cade. So I think he's a clear number 2. And then for 3, I think Suggs is very interesting. I'm most willing to hear arguments of people replacing Suggs at 3 much more than I would be anyone changing up the Cade Mobley order, just because I think Suggs has maybe a little bit further to go skill-wise than a lot of people are willing to acknowledge, but the level of processing is so wild, and the level of impact he's able to have, even with those skill deficiencies at this stage, given his athleticism and processing, are pretty kind of stunning to consider what could happen when those skills do come around. And then for fourth and fifth, I think personally, I don't have either of Green and Kuminga in the top five. I do understand that that's generally sort of the consensus. I'm more willing to get there with Green. I've been watching a lot of him last week, and I've come around a bit more. I think I have him sixth right now. He's uber talented. I just worry about what his sort of ceiling looks like on a winning team in terms of sort of how he plays. He's an epic space creator, projects to be a very skilled scorer and shot maker. But beyond that, not a ton to be offered potentially, which sort of, leaves you with like an excellent number 2 or 3 on a championship team, but maybe not the high level primary you would hope for in sort of a scoring guard. And that kind of leaves you in a weird space team building wise. So that's sort of my concern with him. But I have Scotty Barnes 4 and Jaden Springer 5 right now, which is kind of hot takey, but basically the premise with both of those is Barnes. I understand very well that he's not going to be a wing that maybe he was tabbed as coming out of high school, or all that much of an on-ball creator at all. But I think that the level of processing he has at his size is really, really rare and unlocks a ton for your team if you're able to get one of those guys, sort of in the way that Draymond was unable to sort of unlock things for the Warriors. So I think when you have access to someone with that level of processing in that body, you have to kind of invest whatever it takes to get him. And Springer, just briefly, the youngest American in the draft, who possesses a lot of sort of skills that project well into multiple NBA roles. So he's a terrific on-ball defender, very smart and active off the ball, like certainly will be a plus player on that side. And then also offensively continues to grow in terms of his playmaking ability, his ball handling, some really high level flashes there, shot the ball really well this year. So then kind of banking on age there and current skill, it's very easy to see a scenario in which Jaden Springer is potentially not going to say he's going to be the level of scorer that Jalen Green is, but not so far behind, and definitely has steps ahead of him as a playmaker, and certainly has steps ahead of him as a defender. So that's sort of my thinking there. Okay.
Before we move on, I think that there's something that very interesting to me is the term processing. I kind of have an idea of what that means, but maybe you could flesh out, kind of drill down on what you mean exactly by processing, maybe compare and contrast with like basketball IQ, or how would you describe that term?
Sure. I think a lot of those terms are sort of used interchangeably in terms of basketball IQ, feel, processing, and then of course there's sort of subcategories to all of those, whatever sort of adjective you choose as your optimal one. I go with processing just because a lot of what it has to do. I think feel is a good one too. Like we so often associate basketball IQ with like the coach's son archetype. It just feels sort of
archaic, kind of doesn't really describe the modern NBA and kind of what scouts are determining right now.
Exactly. It feels very dated. I think feel and processing do a better job of sort of describing it as basically the premise is that the higher feel you are, sort of as you take steps up a ladder, let's say, it looks like a staircase. And the higher up you are on the staircase in terms of your level of feel as a player, the greater the returns become as the further up you go to your team. So, you steadily increase feel, and then at the beginning, the level of returns is still sort of steadily increasing. And then as you get sort of higher feel guys, and you get into like the elite of the elite,
it's almost
the impact
exponential.
Doubles. Exactly. It's exponential.
Okay, so let's talk about the prospects a little bit at the top here. And I think I can glean just by listening to what you've said so far about who you see as perhaps the person with the highest ceiling outside of Cade. And I assume that would be Evan Mobley. You mentioned that he is a unicorn type prospect, and it seems like teams are gravitating towards the type of player that he is at the big man position. What do you think that he brings to the table that makes him so unique? And if you were to assign like a player comp, like who would you compare him to?
Sure. The elevator pitch, I guess, with Evan Mobley is that he's 7 feet tall, moves like he's 6'5", has the length and athleticism and agility to protect the rim like you would hope for in a sort of prototypical anchor, defensive anchor center, sort of out of the Gobert, Embiid mold. Not strong enough yet to maybe defend the Embiids of the world, but not too concerned about that given everything else he has to offer. Has grown up, or raised, I should say, in the Los Angeles sort of fraternity of professional basketball players. So has been playing pros since he's been 13, 14, and has been given sort of on-ball offensive responsibilities that entire time because everyone around him sort of saw the vision. Of course, the result now is you have a 19-year-old who is 7'1", 7 feet tall, moves like a gazelle, can put the ball on the floor, and not only do it so that, he's running DHOs and simple actions, but creating space, weaving through traffic, creating windows for himself, has a touch to finish out from, 15 feet in, and has a little bit of a hitch in his shot, but that should be easy to iron out, and given the touch, should be a premium floor spacing 5 as a shooter. So I would say in a lot of drafts, Evan Mobley is a very worthy number 1 pick. It just so happens he falls in a draft with a Luka type prospect who is, every team would pay a premium to have the type of player that Cade is. And the same with Mobley, but just kind of a step below in terms of what you need maybe to build a championship team. There's only, 6 or so guys that Cade at his ceiling can fulfill the same role. Whereas Mobley, still a very small number, but just because he's not going to be individually driving offense, that being the biggest separator between him being 1 and 2, but certainly just another worldly prospect in his own right.
So basically what you're saying is that Cade's role, that of the primary ball handler, is probably the most important role in basketball. And those ball handlers can come from the guard position, and increasingly it seems like these multi-tool, like really advanced forwards with ball handling skills. Would you say that that is the ideal ball handler, is the person with forward height, like a LeBron James type of player?
Yeah, I would. And because the biggest thing, kind of the drum that I'll bang all throughout every sort of draft appearance I'll make, is the 2 biggest things you're seeking from a team building perspective if you want to sort of win a championship, in my opinion. Obviously, this is the 2 sort of overarching objectives. There are many other sub-objectives that would need to be covered, but you want to maximize space offensively and limit space defensively. And so having players like Cade, like LeBron, like Jason Tatum, like all those sort of, 6'6", 6'10"-ish guys who can handle the ball, initiate offense, create their own shot, find shots for others. By having that type of player, you afford yourself the most wiggle room in the 4 other spots to fill out a roster of guys that achieve those 2 goals without sacrificing something on the opposite side, right? So if you have someone like Kyrie, right, who's an amazing off-the-dribble creator, gifted playmaker, but a little bit of a sieve defensively, just in terms of how small he is. And he's been better recently, but just he's not LeBron, he's not Tatum, he's not 6'8", 6'9", covering that type of ground. He's not Giannis, who's basically a defense in and of himself. So simply having that size advantage is big. And then also having, players that height. Of course, you have your unicorns like Giannis, but often they are still athletic enough, just they're naturally 6'7", 6'8" guys are typically more athletic than 7 feet guys. Athletic being, meaning functional athleticism in terms of ability to beat guys off the dribble, to attack closeouts, to cover multiple responsibilities defensively, because of their speed. Those types of athletic profiles are most often found in players that size as well. So that sort of position is where you get this matrix of skill and physical tools that most aptly sort of unlocks the rest of your team building process, just because of what they can provide on both ends.
Right. It seems like with team building, you're willing to, on the guard side of things, you're willing to give up some defensive sort of value because of what they bring on offense. And then the opposite is true from the center position. Usually, whenever you look at the impact metrics, guys who are 7 feet tall, guys who play in the paint, those players are almost always right at the top of like the most impactful defenders. And so usually with guys like, Nikola Jokic, although he's not a incredible defender, the fact that you can have a guy who's 7 feet tall on the floor almost the entire game without giving up anything offensively. In fact, your offense goes sort of through the roof. You're not giving anything up, which is, I think, as you said, the value of those forwards that are able to contribute so much on offense is because you're not giving up anything on the other side of the ball. Is that a good sort of synopsis of?
Yeah, I would say it is. And also, of course, this is the other side of the coin here, which is maybe equally as important, is that being that size allows you to maximize those technical skills in ways that players that are smaller can't, right. Just on like a parallel level, right? Like there are passes that Luka can make that Kyrie cannot make because Luka can throw it over the defense in a way that Kyrie can't. So there's two sides to it. I think both are probably, I don't know if equal importance, but definitely both of relative importance.
Okay. Maybe we can parlay this into talking about players that you could see maybe contributing next season. Because if the Toronto Raptors, let's say, fall out of the playoff hunt or the play-in hunt, they're going to be looking for guys to help them win next season. So do you see any players that perhaps maybe in the 10-ish spot could maybe help them in competing next season?
Yeah, it's hard at this stage, especially in this draft. It feels like for whatever reason, there's just been so much moving around that's happened in terms of, typically you can look at a Draft Express mock draft or whatever and kind of have a general idea of where players are expected to go, but just given the stage of where we are in this particular year, it feels like that's not the case. But in terms of like guys who seem like they will go near that sort of like back end of the lottery range, I think one that makes a ton of sense is someone who's ready to contribute immediately is Franz Wagner from Michigan.
Okay.
Very talented 6'9" wing who can handle the ball. Can't really shoot quite yet, and that might be a little bit of a concern for his sort of immediate translatability. And granted, is not the type of player who's going to be creating his own shot or doing anything like that, but as a sort of plug and play wing who can step in and take rotation minutes in that sort of the cachet of wings that the Raptors have and like to throw out in different combinations. Franz projects to be someone who can fit in immediately and take bench minutes and fill a role in that way.
Is there anyone else that you could see the Raptors taking in the 10-ish range that might be able to contribute right away?
I think the obvious sort of answer, as much as it may pain me given sort of my philosophy on how you should be ordering youth, is Davion Mitchell from Baylor.
Right.
On the older end, like I said, but certainly talented. I do think the shooting is a little bit fluky given the jump he had this year in three-point shooting percentage and the lack of jump he had in free throw percentage. I think that and on low sample size, I think that it's hard to imagine he's a 40% three-point shooter in the NBA or anything close to it, but I do think the defensive chops and sort of off-ball playmaking next to someone like Van Vliet is interesting, even though I personally prefer to take someone bigger who can play in that, like I said, in that sort of rotation of the magic sort of, vault of wings that the Raptors seem to always have. But I'm sure that Davion will be a popular choice.
That is fantastic stuff. Thanks, Henry. Let's move on. The next issue is fit. And so obviously, I think that the consensus in terms of team building is to take players who are going to be good, like look for guys who have talent, and then the chips will fall where they may. Trying to draft for fit seems like a bit of a fool's errand. However, the Raptors, as you may well know, have been on the hunt for a capable center this entire season. And so maybe you could give us a breakdown on some of the guys that you see at the big position that might be the best picks in the draft at that position.
Sure. So I do have to say, I think it's a pretty... I think it's unfair to say the draft is devoid of bigs in a way that future drafts won't be, because I think just of the way the game is trending, all the quote unquote bigs we have been used to seeing are going to just be more and more wing-ish with their sort of skill sets. So I think that there's a lack of traditional bigs in this draft, but it's not going to be an uncommon occurrence moving forward. So I do think with sort of the quote unquote, bigger players in the draft that the Raptors could potentially take and plug into those sort of high forward lineups where they're sort of getting, rim protection by potluck, as opposed to having a guy, a Gobert standing in the middle of the key, deterring attempts, you guys, compiling enough ancillary rim protectors to sort of create something that is, or a whole that's greater than some of the parts.
Right.
And so someone who I'd love to see in Toronto, but that probably won't happen, is Scotty Barnes, because that is sort of the forte with him, is despite a lack of athleticism, having the size, wingspan, and feel to sort of deter attempts his own way at 6'9" with a 7-foot wingspan and just being an amazing thinker. I don't think Mobley will follow them in their laps. That would be obviously the best case scenario.
Unless obviously they get really lucky and, draft top 2.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always that.
There's always that chance. And for your guys' sake, I'm hoping for it. But let's, for sake of discussion, let's assume it's off the table. Then I think, there is Kai Jones, who is an amazing athlete, fluid mover for his size, just pretty raw in terms of skills at this point, but flashes some really amazing skills that guys his size just don't typically have, shooting off the dribble, pull up jump shots and step back threes, and just that mix with his athleticism and his size is pretty special at 6'10", 6'11". And then you guys, you have like Isaiah Jackson, maybe even like Jalen Johnson, if you want to consider him a big, Usman Garuba, Greg Brown, just a bunch of guys who are kind of Roko Perkichin, a bunch of like sort of 6'9" plus guys who have plenty of holes they need to fix, which is why I would not advocate for going after this certain player in the draft, given how many sort of wing guard types there are that I think are far more talented. So I don't think they will find that guy in the draft, but I do think there is maybe a case to be made for finding some value in the second round, potentially. Guys like Daron Sharp, maybe Garuba falls, maybe Greg Brown falls, who knows? And then you can, scoop one of those guys later. But I think generally aiming to take a big in this draft with where the Raptors will be picking is, you're foregoing some value there.
So we've kind of discussed the importance of bigs on defense. So maybe I can use that as a way to segue it to my next question, which is about defense.
I'm sure you know all about Nick Nurse. He's a kind of tough-minded coach. He doesn't like to play players unless they meet a certain criteria. And that criteria that has been very evident is that if you can't learn his defensive schemes, or if you do know his schemes but you're just not good enough defensively, then you won't be part of his rotation. And there are a number of players that, maybe haven't met the threshold offensively that he will still play because they do know his schemes and are very good defenders. So are there players in this draft that you foresee as being impact defenders, players that have really high defensive potential?
Certainly. I think Scotty Barnes, I can't say his name enough, is one of those guys. Like I said, Jaden Springer, another one of those guys, Moses Moody, Keon Johnson. Well, his sort of developmental proposition will be based on his ability defensively to kind of buoy him in terms of getting him playing time that will allow him to develop what he needs to develop. So that'll be a big thing for him, is contributing day one defensively. And then that gives them time to sort of round out their offensive skill sets, because they'll be providing enough defensively to where they'll get coaches' attention, they'll get investment. Hopefully they'll get playing time. And from there, you can sort of round out the sort of rawer offensive aspects that they have. But I do think there's a good handful of guys who would be, big Nick Nurse would be big fans of, just because they are super high field defensively, super high effort, and obviously have the physical tools to carry them and allow them to make an impact. So while those guys, for the most part, sort of seem like they're going to be, again, who knows where they're going to actually be picked or where they're being talked about being picked. We'll get a better idea of that closer to the draft. But sort of for me, guys who project to go in the sort of early to mid 20s, that range is loaded with guys who will fit that archetype.
Amazing. I think that wraps up all of the things that I really wanted to talk about today. And I just want to say to my guest, Henry, it's been a real pleasure to be able to talk with you and pick your brain about the draft, talk team building strategy, and really get to understand the scouting process. It's definitely been an eye-opening experience, and I really hope that my viewers feel the same way, because it was a rewarding interview. But before we sign off, is there anything that you would like to plug?
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter at Henry W. Ward. I write for Pro Insight, the company I work for. throughout the college season, I had a weekly column that will have sort of 2 future editions coming out shortly. No longer weekly because the season has ended, but we'll still be talking about stuff over there. I have a locker room show with my friend Jake Rosen every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, called On the Clock, where we basically just hang out and do this, just talk draft for an hour. So come through to that if it interests you. And other than that, you'll kind of just be able to follow along with whatever I'm doing on my Twitter.
Excellent. Thanks again to my guest, Henry Ward. And to my viewers, please let me know if you have any questions about this week's episode. Be sure to follow Henry on Twitter and also follow me on Twitter for daily Raptors and NBA musings. Also, please subscribe to the channel and like the video, as that helps the channel grow. And as always, thanks for tuning in to Raptors Report, your source for in-depth Raptors content.